And now we will be moving on to one of the highlighted events in today's agenda, which is none other than the keynote speech. Before we move on to the keynote speech, let me give you a brief introduction.
Going in line with the time, no?
Where Professor N.S. Kure holds a BA of Honors from University of Colombo and Diploma in Economic Development also from University of Colombo. And he has done his MA in Economics at University of Japan and obtained his PhD at Nagoya University. And also, Professor Kure is a professor in economics at Graduate Schools of International Relations, International University of Japan. He was the Associate Dean of the Graduate Schools of International Relations and the Director of the International Peace Studies Program. He is the current President of the Sri Lankan Academic Association in Japan. He was a research associate and the coordinated project on Sustainable Development Framework for Indonesia and Ecosystem Framework for Small Island States at the United Nations University. When we talk about his experience, Professor Kure has more than 35 years of teaching, research, training, and administrative experience. So, in this great occasion, let me cordially invite our keynote speaker for the day, Professor N.S. Kure, who will be joining all the way from Japan. Over to you, sir.
Hello, good morning. May I request Dr. Pavitra Madhuvanti to share my screen? Hello, may I share my screen?
Yes, sir.
Still not possible.
We are in the process of sharing, sir. Just hold on.
Oh, okay.
Hope now you can see, sir.
Okay, thank you very much for nice introduction. Good morning to everybody. Most venerable priest of other faith, Senior Professor Sudanta Liyanage, Vice Chancellor of the University, and Dean of the Faculty, Professor P.D. Nimal, Head of the Department, Dr. Pavitra Madhuvanti, and Senior Professor Fernando, and distinguished faculty members of the university, dear students, friends, ladies and gentlemen. It is with great pleasure that I accepted the invitation to be the keynote speaker of this morning research session. And let me begin by thanking Dr. Pavitra Madhuvanti, my friend Professor Saman Dasanayake, who is joining here with us over Zoom from Tokyo, for arranging this opportunity to be with you. My topic, as you can see here, why research on the nexus of public policy and the well-being of citizens, an institutional roadmap to plenty. When I accepted the invitation, I knew that I'm going to speak to a group of intellectual giants from the department who is sharing their research based on their thesis or dissertation or whatever you call it. And the topic that I selected, as you can see, is public policy. I know this public policy, Sri Lanka, there are no many departments. I think only this, the Department of Management of the university is teaching public policy, Sri Lanka. And we also know the public policy is very important nowadays in Sri Lanka, given the political situation of the country. And if you look at all political parties' election manifesto, and almost all governments since independence, they were talking about achieving economic progress, improving welfare of citizens. Basically, they are talking about the well-being of citizens, because it is according to their mandate, election manifesto, it is their mandate to improve the well-being of citizens of Sri Lanka. And it has been the only department in Sri Lanka which teaches public policy. I thought I should speak to you on this topic of public policy and well-being of citizens. And at the same time, when we talk about the effect of public policy on the well-being of citizens, we have to talk about institutional mechanism that any particular country, in this case Sri Lanka, is having to achieve this, the well-being. And therefore, I thought when we talk about research, this is a very important area to see the effect of public policy on the well-being of citizens. So therefore, I thought maybe I should speak to you how we can do research in this important area of study. So with this, let me just continue my discussion. I'm going to share a story of Sri Lanka, but I'm not telling anything about Sri Lanka to you, because I thought since I have been away from the country for the last 30 years, you gentlemen know much more than me about Sri Lanka. So therefore, I will speak to you about other countries, mainly focusing on top developed countries in the world, and share my views on what kind of roadmap of the institution that we Sri Lanka need to achieve higher well-being of the citizen. And this is how I'm going to organize my talk. Why do we research? How do we get to know? How do we know about the well-being of citizens? Why do nations fail? And institutional roadmap to plenty. I'm going to share some empirical evidence from top 4 economies of the world. And as I said earlier, I knew that I'm going to speak to intellectual giant, a group of intellectual giant in the department. I'm referring to our students' friends. And we do research for different purposes. The first question I would like to share with you. So since I'm talking to a group of researchers, so I'm always asking this question, why? Because it's a very important question that every researcher should ask. We need to think of proper set of questions when we start our research. So with the same approach, I'm just asking the first question in my discussion, why do we research? We research because we have curiosity. We want to know because of our curiosity. If you talk to many people, so maybe you have heard of that, or if somebody is asking so many information, so many questions, so many inquiries, or perhaps that person has an inquiry mind. because they are basically, because of that inquiry mind, we are eager to know things. And we have been asking this big question, like why we are here, who created this world, was it the God created this world? Are we alone in this universe? What is the nature of the reality? So what do we mean by reality? And all these questions are basically, centuries old questions. But it is only recently that scientific inquiry or scientific way of answering these questions are relatively new. Back in ancient time, we used gods to explain everything. We had gods for like cranes, thundering, volcanoes, like that. So the next question that I would like to ask when we do research, basically we have to ask, how do we know what we know? According to skeptics, we might not know what we think we know. Those days, knowledge is within, just within easy reach. Within seconds, you can get so much of information. But how do we know whether we know what we know? Questioning how we came to know what we know, whether we really know what we think we know, inspire us to evaluate scientifically the information we receive, the opinion we hold, the knowledge we take for granted. And there are two philosophers I should mention here who gave some kind of way of understanding our knowledge. René Descartes, who started to teach us reasoning. We call it rationalism. So basically, we reason, we ask questions, reason to obtain knowledge. And the other important philosopher that we should mention here, John Locke, he introduced what we call empiricism. So according to him, we need to have empirical observation, empirical evidence to know. So these are the two kind of approaches that nowadays we use, like qualitative research and quantitative research. So that's the kind of foundation behind this qualitative research and quantitative research. And then the next question I would like to share with you is, how do we get to know? Definitely we need scientific research. And it was Stephen Hawking who wrote this book titled The Grand Design, according to Hawking. So there are 4 steps that has to be satisfied if the research is acceptable. So first one, it should be elegant, and it should be dependent, not too much, too many. It should not be dependent on so many random factors. And the third criteria to be a good model is the model needs to explain every existing observation. And the fourth criteria that one should have to have a good way of research or to have a good model is future predictability. So these are the 4 criteria that one can use when we do scientific research, according to Stephen Hawking, one of the leading physicists in the world. And how do we do research in social sciences? So economics, I'm economist by training. So we believe that economics is a science. So economists are therefore scientists. So scientists also use models, data, construct theories, all kind of things. And these are the classical way of doing research, in economics. We have several steps. We need to have a theory. We need to have a mathematical model, then econometric model, obtain data, estimate parameters, testing hypothesis, and then use model for policy analysis and forecasting. Let me just show you one example which I estimated yesterday. If anyone of in this audience want to know how we spend our money. Because with your income, we can do two things, in my understanding. Either we can spend on our consumption and the remaining part we can save. So with your income, either we have two activities, basically. Either we spend on our consumption or saving. Now, with this, let me just show you, as I said, economists or social scientists, we use models. So these are some of the familiar models that one can see. Roadmap. If you want to take travel in Tokyo area, you need to have a roadmap because there are 13 subway lines, so you get confused. So without a map, you cannot walk through in the city. Even Japanese, it's quite difficult for them to find, the locations. So we use different kind of, models. So model is a kind of simplified representation of reality. So economists also use this model to understand the behavior of people in the real world. And I just collected data because I just wanted to show you, how Sri Lankans spend on their consumption. So if somebody want to do research to understand how Sri Lankans spend their money. So I just estimated this consumption equation based on Keynesian theory. And I came up with this coefficient, but we call it marginal propensity to consume. So it's 0.7. So what does it mean? So with this estimation, this quantification, I came to know that on average, Sri Lankans spend 70% of their income on consumption. So these are what we call scientific research. So we can quantify, we are coming with figures and data, and we can educate policymakers. So this is how Sri Lankans spend on their consumption. So this is just to show you one example. And now let's deal with what do we know about well-being? Because the part of title of my talk is well-being. So we are going to discuss how public policy influence well-being. So before we talk about the link between effect of public policy on well-being, let me just tell you something about well-being. What do we mean by well-being? As we all know, well-being depend on income. If you have more income, you're better off. Of course, this is what I say well-being. I generally refer to the material well-being. I'm not talking about anything about what we call it spiritual well-being. So therefore, for example, if you think of citizens' well-being, so which depends on the, or we also can call it standard of living. So standard of living or well-being of a country depends on its ability to produce goods and services. So then this ability depends on your productivity. If productivity is very high, you have more capacity to produce more of goods and services, and you can get more income. So if you have more income, then people are happy. So happiness basically also linked to well-being. And then it is not only income or wealth that you have, which can represent your well-being, but we also have to look at how this wealth is being distributed. If the income is unequally distributed, then people are not happy. And we also have to think of other factors which create our well-being, which help improve our well-being. Of course, well-being also depends on the environment, because nature drastically improves mental, and then therefore the physical and health benefit or health. So we also need to think of the environment. And nowadays there are a lot of discussion going on about Sri Lankan environmental related issues. So as public policy makers or students of public policy, public management, I think we need to know what do we mean by well-being, because otherwise we don't know what we are going to improve, because the aim of public policy is to improve the well-being of citizens. And let me show you some data relating to this income wealth distribution. Now, well-being, I said, depend on income. So income depend on your ability to produce goods and services. So basically, this data tells you how countries, selected countries have been growing for more than 100 years. For example, if you think of China, it has been growing at 2.64% for last 100 years, more than 100 years, from 1900 to 2017. And then Japan, if you look at Japan has been growing at a rate of 2.6 annual rate. So this growth rate, higher the growth rate, higher the ability to produce goods and services, so higher the level of well-being of a country. Now let me show you how countries, the material well-being have been distributed using this map. You can see here the green color shows the rich countries, so countries with high per capita income, and definitely they have higher well-being. And let me show you this picture, and I'm going to show you how well-being is linked to per capita income. So this picture represents a family from an advanced country, which is UK. So their per capita income is 36,000 and their life expectancy is 80 years, literacy ratio is 99. And this is a family of from an advanced country. Now let's move on to the next picture. This is a family from Mexico with per capita income of 14,000, 76, their life expectancy. Now, this picture is a poor family from Mali. So their per capita 52 years, and their literacy is very low of 46%. So what does this three countries, level of income tells us? Or what? Explain. It's basically this per capita income can explain those differences in life expectancy and adult literacy ratio. So what I am trying to say is there's a strong link between per capita income and well-being of citizens. Now, we can also show the strong positive correlation between per capita income level of happiness. So you can see from this group, the whole countries, have positive trend. Higher the income, higher the level of happiness. And also this well-being also linked to many other conflicts. For example, if you think of the great ideologies of liberalism, socialism, nationalism, all these ideology basically was established or created based on income inequality or poverty. It's basically relating to well-being. And if you look at revolutions in America, what we call it American Revolution, French Revolution, Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, all revolutions are linked with the material well-being of citizens, basically income and income distribution. Now, let's move on to our next topic. In my understanding, this is kind of perhaps the most important part of my talk, because this link shows the relationship between public policy and well-being. So we are asking this question: why do nations fail? And how do we know the impact of public policy on an institution on well-being? Now, let me show you a very interesting book, Why Nations Fail, published by Asimoglu in MIT, and then Robinson from Chicago University. So these two authors basically explain answers, why some countries are rich while some other countries are poor. So according to them, you can see here why nations fail. It's very simple. They argue that countries fail because it has been ruled by a narrow elite that have organized society for their own benefit at the expenses of vast mass of people. So I said, I'm going to tell you a development story of Sri Lanka, but I'm not going to mention the name of Sri Lanka. So because you know much better than about Sri Lanka than me, because I have been away. So when I share this slide with you, why nation fail, I'm not going to tell you referring to any particular country, but you can think of any country which are basically why we are behind growth. So why nation fail? It's because the narrow elite, what we call it political bourgeoisie of a country, maybe few people, they are organizing the whole society for their own benefit at the cost of vast majority of people of a country. So they argue, taking some example from different countries. So in their book, Why Nation Fail, the authors asking this question: why Japan became first developed country in Asia? And if you look at African countries, none of African countries have high economic growth or no developed country there. And if you look at Asian, South Asian countries, there is no any country what we can call developed country in South Asia. And if you think of Americas, I'm referring to North America and South America. So the same group of people from Europe went to those both America, North and South. But if you look at North American development, US development or Canadian development, if compare with Latin American countries development, there's a huge gap between these two regions. So why the same group of people migrated at the same time, but why North America developed while South America was not? And same argument can apply to Korea. We have North Korea and South Korea, the same country which was divided during World War II. And South Korea became one of the developed country now, while North Korea is still poor. And if you look at the case of German, West German and East German, the country, it was together, but after World War II, it was divided between West and East. And West Germany has become the fourth largest developed country in the world, fourth largest economy in the world, while East, we don't know, I mean, this is very below. So why do we have this kind of differences? Was it because of the economic policies are responsible for these growth differences of countries? Or is it because of geographical reason? Or it is because of cultural factors or value system which can explain all these differences of all these countries? No. According to Asimigolo and Johnson, they say it is basically institution can explain these differences. They argue that it is political institution that determine economic institution. So these institution basically explain these growth differences. If one country is failing, it is because of not policies, but basically due to lack of institution. So why these top 4 countries that I'm going to talk today, because these 4 countries have, or high developed countries have used appropriate institutional mechanism for their development. So that is why we have to learn about institutional importance of institutional mechanism. So according to them, there are two different kind of institution. Extractive institution, which is a small group of individuals do their best to exploit the rest of the population. So it's extractive institution. And the other group of institution, we call it inclusive institution, which is many people are included, which is democratic way of establishing institution. And the process of governing, hence the exploitation is absent. So for a country to grow, achieve development, we definitely need this inclusive type of institution. Now let's move on to see why this inclusive institution is important, because inclusive institution basically secure private property that encourage entrepreneurship. So without entrepreneurs, no country can develop. So entrepreneurs are doing their activities, particularly invention, doing business, because they have to have some secure situation. Their property rights are being secured, their activities are protected. So otherwise we won't be able to get inventors or entrepreneurs. So it is only through this inclusive institution countries can generate entrepreneurs. So they are the people who are going to bring the country to next stage. And according to them, so there are 2 types of institution I just mentioned. So inclusive institution and exclusive institution. So what we can see here, if you look at here, we have political institution. This is what we call political and economic, and then inclusive and exclusive institution. If you look at here, inclusive institution here. So what do we mean by inclusive institutions? Broad distribution of influence on policy decision, plurality, and checks and balances, and rule of law is there. So if you look at here, extractive institution, and this is rent extraction and redistribution to the elite. So it's basically a handful of people are extracting the resources for their benefit. So what is very important for a country is we need to have inclusive political institution and inclusive economic institution. So these are the type of institution that Asimoglu has explained to us: economic institution, market perfection, rule of law, corruption control, and political institution. We need political stability, political competitiveness, constraint on politicians, professionalism, and then value institution mean trust, openness, self-initiative. So these are the very important institutions that we want to have for a country. Now, when it comes to research, how do we do research? What are the areas we should focus in our research, particularly our student friend from the Department of Management? We have to do research basically on 3 areas: society, state, and market. Because when we look at political economy analysis, these are 3 important pillars. So if we want to see the effect of public policy, we need to do research in these 3 areas relating to how those institutions influence the society, to state, and market. And in economic analysis, we use this kind of framework. The earlier slides, you can see how political economists use, analyze the effect of government policy on the economy. Economists use this approach. They use 4 sectors and 3 markets: household, firms, government, foreign, and then 3 markets. How these stakeholders, 4 sectors are operating in 3 markets: goods market, factor market, and financial market. You will see this is how economists analyze the effect of public policy on the economy. So for those who are engaged in research activities, I think they need to do research in these 4 sectors and 3 markets and see how public policy influences these 4 sectors and 3 markets. Now, let me just share you very important 3 books. I think the Nation Fail I have already discussed, and the other 2 books, Narrow Corridor, also written by same authors, and the other one is Raghuraman Rajan. He was governor of the Indian Central Bank. And what they are going to tell, so according to this 3rd pillar, they are talking about the society. So the community, that's how he explained this 3rd pillar. So according to him, we are now out of balance. So this book argues that many countries, this 3rd pillar is basically ignored. And what we really need is we have to have a balance of these 3 pillars: social life, state, market, and communities. So this is his major conclusion is we need to have inclusive localism so that we can bring this 3rd pillar, community or civil society, to a next stage, so that we can, because when we think of these 3 pillars, markets have its own benefit and failures. Markets do have failures, and then when markets do have failures, the government can take care of market failures. When government when government is failing, then civil society can take care of government failures. So therefore, we need to have a delicate balance among these 3 pillars: market, state, and civil society. So then only country can bring to the next stage of development. And in this book, The Narrow Corridor: States, Societies, and Fate of Liberty. So this book argues that liberty is important. Many countries are losing liberty. Liberty in terms of doing activities, or economic liberty, social freedom. So we need to have a strong state is necessary to control violence, enforce laws, and provide public service. We also need a strong society it is necessary to control and shackle the strong states. So then only we can have these three pillars, delicate balance among these three pillars. So now let me move on to my next section, how institution influence. I'm going to show you how these four top countries, US, China, Japan, and Germany, four top countries, what kind of institution those countries have implemented to achieve their, progress. Now, based on the research, getting empirical evidence, I said that when we do research, we need to have empirical evidence, facts. So that's what John Locke mentioned. So taking example from Europe, North America, and some of Asian countries, we know that institutional determinants that allow modern economies to flourish. So what are those institutional mechanisms those countries have implemented? Some of institutional mechanisms include rule of law, right to private property, open competitive market, and atmosphere of individual liberty for education and health. So individual liberty also very important. Now let me show you how these countries contribute to the well-being of whole world. You can see here United States just contributing to the global wealth about 25%, and then China 12%, Japan 6%, German 4%. And you can see how the global wealth is being basically distributed among region, among countries. So now this will show again how well-being is basically divided in the world. And you will see here these top countries and these four countries, how they have been growing. And now let me move on to just give some example from US. So what kind of political economy model that US has implemented? We call it market-oriented capitalism, because capitalism also has a different variant. So in US, what we call it market-oriented capitalism. Now let's see how market-oriented capitalist policies have influenced to achieve US progress. I'm just taking this example not about economic, but about the football players. Can you believe that this University of Wisconsin have data for more than 100 years, the data about their own players? So you will see here the weight of average weight of starting football players in 1902. So it is 173 pounds. And then in 2012, they have grown up to 237. You can see how average weight has increased over last more than 100 years. And you can see here this 5 largest players. In 1902, 184 pounds. But in 2012, it has 333 pounds. You can see by looking at this growth of players, you can see how countries are also progressing. Of course, it can be a problem like obesity, it's something different, but I'm just showing you, I'm impressed with the data they have, this university level data about their own players. And this, of course, height also has increased. For example, if you think of the people who are playing at the center, in 1939, they were just 6 feet and 4 inches. And 2012, 6 feet and 10 inches. So they have grown up by 6 inches. So it's a kind of big achievement for a country. So why they have grown? It's because of well-being has gone up. Now, this is also quite interesting. This will show, household ownership of, amenities. For example, in 1900, people had just telephone and automobiles. Now you can see here how automobile has gone up here by 60, almost more than 100. It's about 100% people have automobiles. And telephone in 1900, only less than 10% of people had telephones and automobile. But now you can see here, by 60, almost everybody has phone, everybody has automobile. So this tells how the well-being have increased in the US for last 100 years. So that's because of They claim that they have achieved it because of market-oriented capitalism. And see, these are the factors they have, benefited. Technology, specialization of division of labor, economies of scale, organization of resource allocation, and human capital. These are the determinants of the factors which have improved their well-being. And what are the institutions they had? These are very important. I don't have time to explain everything in detail, but I will just, this Council of Economic Advisors, they started in 1946, Internal Revenue Service, and then National Bureau of Economic Research, we call it NBR. These are some of the institutions which have helped achieve their progress. However, despite all this development, US has a strong, big problem now because of income disparity. You will see here how this 1% of people share has gone, it was high and gone down, and this shows high income inequality in US. We can learn lessons from US, particularly relating to the productivity, but not relating to the income distribution. For income distribution lessons, I think we should look at Japan and Germany perhaps. Now, it is also interesting whenever countries see, if you look at the recent data, you can see here the more equal societies are better able to control pandemics. You can see here a group of countries with equal society. They are better in operating this pandemic situation. You can see here Germany, New Zealand, Norway, South Korea, Canada. So they are in the bottom. So the pandemic is better controlled by this better income distributed countries. And you can see here the higher number of countries, pandemic affected countries, Mexico, Brazil, the US, they are not basically equal societies. You can see here the well-being, how well-being, the income distribution, wealth distribution influence the well-being of a country. Now, let's move on to China. So China, this year it reached to they are getting 70% of the income, which is if you compare US GDP, they are 70% similar. And what they are targeting, so they just had the Communist Party meeting on 5th of this month. So by end of 2035, their target, they want to replace US. So China says itself replacing the US as the world's largest economy by 2035. So just in 15 years after, China will reach #1 economy. Now you can see here how China has reduced their poverty. If you look at China opened up their economy in 1978, at the time of when they introduced market-oriented policies, 7.7 billion, 100 million, they were having, this, poverty. And the poverty level is, 97.5% of people were below poverty. Now in 2070, you can see here, in percentage wise, they are just, about 3%. You can see how, this poverty has gone down in China. How they achieve this poverty level? You can see, according to World Bank, Chinese policymakers have managed to bring more than 730 million out of poverty from 90 to 2015. Most other developed countries took 100 and 150, between 100 and 150 years to accomplish this task. Now, China achieved this just within 25 years, wherever other developed countries have taken more than 100 or 150 years to achieve that. How China achieved it is because of government-sponsored programs, particularly this TVE, what we call it, town village enterprises. So this was basically behind this big achievement of China. So so what their target is, 2050, China will be reaching to this level. So the US #2, India #3, Indonesia #4, Japan will be #5 in terms of nominal GDP in 2050. Now, so they are going beyond their national targets, they are also creating, they want to be #1 economy. How they create, they have created institution, that can bring China to the #1 economy. So this is BRI project, Belt and Road Initiative project. So that covers 64 countries, and it's covering 63% of the world population, 35% of world merchandise trade, and 30% of world GDP. So this is the biggest project in 21st century. And so they are also creating what we call it AIIB. And now let me move on to Japan. So what kind of lessons that, Japan can give us? So Japanese, what is the system of Japanese development model? We call it developmental state. So Japan is regarded as a miracle country. So they have, you can see how they have achieved after, World War II, it went down, here, and then they pick up, and then now you can see how Japan is moving. How they did it because of, they are the institution. State-led development model. That is what we call developmental state model. So particularly the MITI, Ministry of Industry and Trade, that was the kind of, the major institution that helped Japan to achieve this big achievement. And now let's move on to German. So German is the system that implements social market economy, and Sri Lanka also introduced this social market economy in 2015. And what is the message that we can get from this German system of social market capitalism? So German system of political economy attempts to balance social concern and market efficiency. These are very important things. Balance social concern and market efficiency. I think this is a key thing that Sri Lanka can learn: social concern and market efficiency. So you also can see how German, have been going with the US, from 1950 to now. And so this is the growth differences between West Germany and East Germany. So West Germany, they implemented socialist system, and West Germany, they implemented market-oriented capitalism. So in, these are the things that the one can learn from German. So they have two different kind of two principles: constitutive principle and regulatory principle. So you can see here, the priority of modern monetary stability, open markets, property rights, freedom of, of contract. And this is a regulatory principle which talk about social inequality. So they take care of social concern from this principle. Now you can see here there's a very important thing here. Consistency in economic policy is one lesson that Sri Lanka can learn from German case. So I think these are the 4 cases that I just want to share with you, what kind of lessons that we can learn from case studies. And based on this empirical study, so let me draw this conclusion, because when we do research, we have to get some conclusion or concluding remarks or findings from what we have done. So far, I have shown you some empirical evidence relating to 4 countries, US, China, Japan, and German. And based on this empirical evidence, what kind of conclusion that I can draw. So as we know that public policy is very important subject. Unfortunately, it is only this Department of Public Management is teaching this subject, in my understanding. No other Sri Lankan university is teaching this important subject. So we need more universities to establish this public policy program so that we can train leaders and public policy makers. And also when it comes to research, I think we need to do multidisciplinary applied and theoretical research. Applied and theoretical research. I'm focusing on applied research. Japan is a country where we can learn a lot of things for applied research. France, they did a lot of theoretical research, but Japan, they did more applied research. US, for example, so transistor was developed in US. So they did it because of theoretical research. But when it comes to application of transistor, Japan did a lot of application, and they are making a lot of money because of this applied research. I think we need to have multidisciplinary approach for applied and using applied and theoretical research. So that's, I think, a message I want to share with my, researchers, young researchers in the department. And then, as I said earlier, Sri Lanka introduced social market economy in 2015, which German started in 1961. So, but, we don't have elements, when we say social market economy, these two, we have to have social concern under the word social, and under market, we have to respect the market principle. I think we are not too much of, paying much attention to this word, even though we introduced this social market economy in 2015, we still have to ensure, I think, both aspects. For example, what German did, German state ensure that the free market produces results close to its theoretical potential. That means we have to have proper legal system, we have to have proper political system that will help entrepreneurs to achieve market potential. And then we also have this protection of human dignity and personal freedom is essential. It's a part of social market economy. So SME has three critical pillars: free market, people and society's participation, and strong state. I think what Sri Lanka, I think we are lacking this people, society's participation. I think we need to improve that area. So, and also in social market economy, we have to think of the human aspect and also the economic aspect. See, both are very important research area. I think our young researchers in the department can think of these policies. So let me, this is my last one. I don't know, maybe you are the best person to tell about the institution, the trustworthiness of institution in Sri Lanka. So I'm not going to tell anything about that, but what I feel from kind of, when I look at from distance, people are losing the trust in major institutions, including legislature, executive, and even judicial system of Sri Lanka. These are very important institutions that we country need. And so we need what I call it inclusive political and inclusive economic institution. So we need to have a, of course, delicate balance of these pillars which I mentioned: state, market, and civil society. So therefore, we definitely should go with the kind of inclusive localism based on these three cases. We can get best practices from other countries, other 4 countries which I discussed, and also other countries which I have not discussed. So I think as researchers in the department, we should do empirical, theoretical research and empirical research in order to draw some lessons from best practices from elsewhere relating to productivity growth, and also the to have, if we can have productivity improvement, definitely we can have higher level, we can reach to the next level of well-being. And of course, we can learn many lessons from these 4 countries about market principle and social harmony. And also, let me just give you one example from Japan. So 100 years ago, at the early last century, Japan had 80% of forest coverage, and Sri Lanka also had the 80% of forest coverage. And in Sri Lanka, we have about 20% of forest coverage. Asian average is 22, and our Sri Lankan forest coverage is just 20%. Still, Japan has 65% of their forest coverage. If you look at the development level of these 2 countries, Japan has reached to high level of development. Sri Lanka is not, but we have lost our forest coverage. Japan still maintains 65%. Sri Lanka has just about 20%, and both countries had 80% of forest coverage at the beginning of last century. So with this, I will stop here. You can see, what kind of lessons that, we can learn from these top 4 countries, and what kind of research that, our, young researchers should consider. We need to do a lot of research to see the effect of public policy on the well-being of any country. I think with this, I will stop here. So once again, I thank the organizers for inviting me. And I wish you all success in your research. So thank you so much for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your inspirational, valuable thoughts that you have made, who shared within our wider academic audience. And at the same time, personally, I do believe that the thoughts that you have shared in this great occasion will greatly encourage our undergraduates as well for their future academic and research activities. So, Professor, the Department of Public Administration has prepared a token of appreciation by identifying your valuable contribution towards the success of the event. So please accept this token of appreciation, and on behalf of the Department of Public Administration, I would like to wish you all the very best for your future endeavors.
Thank you so much. I wish you all the best in your research. Right. I'm sorry I took longer time than I was given 40 minutes, but I used more than 40 minutes. I'm sorry for that. I apologize for it. Yeah. So thank you.